Thanks so much, everybody, for joining. Yeah, it's really an honor to share the stage after all these amazing presentations. I'm going to leave Tokyo very inspired, so thank you so much for bringing us all together here in person, and everybody who is responsible for helping to bring me and my work here. Really a heartfelt thank you. I'm going to be talking about my piece in the exhibition. Since you were born, perhaps it's fitting that after some death there is some birth at the end here. My presentation, I was going to center around this work, but show a little bit of the work that was leading up to it and a little bit of the work that I've been doing after that project. So I'm going to start with where I view my art practice as starting, which is with a very earlier version of the internet. Previously, I was an architect. I was working in architecture, and this was the early 2000s, and the internet kind of just came into popular consciousness, and it was a very different internet than today, and it had sharing at its core. There were all these peer-to-peer networks that were not networks made by corporations, but were networks made by individual people that came together in an economy of sharing rather than an economy of capitalism. And it was very inspiring to me. And even from just a sort of personal empowerment standpoint, like I couldn't believe that with the Pirate Bay I had access to every piece of software, every piece of music, every piece of film. This was too exciting for me to do architecture anymore. So I went into the arts, and I made some work. I'm gonna start my earlier projects back in 2006. This was with a collaborative project called Graffiti Research Lab. This project brought me to Tokyo with, I see Yosuke in the back here, brought me in 2006 to show a project called Laser Tag. Graffiti Research Lab, the basic idea of this project was that we were working with graffiti writers and we were working with activists, and we were trying to come up with existing technologies that maybe had not been misused yet in public space. So the goal was to sort of amplify the voices of individual people within the city in the face of government and in the face of advertising. Laser Tag is one example of those projects. All the projects were free software, open source, and meant to be shared and encouraged to be replicated. Moving a little bit further in time, this is members of the Graffiti Research Lab, along with other friends of ours, collaborated on another project. This was 2010. This is a project that also came to NACT, called the iWriter Project, which was a collaboration with Tempt One, who was a graffiti writer in Los Angeles who had ALS, which is a degenerative disease that leaves you with no movement. So he could only move his eyes, no other movement. He's a very influential graffiti writer. And so the group of us came together to make this project.
Where we are right now. Small suburb outside of downtown Los Angeles.
That would help him be able to write graffiti again around Los Angeles. And so we made this free software system that would do eye tracking. This documentation is from a week where we worked with him in the hospital room. We had one set up in the hospital room where he could write graffiti, and then we had another crew, another team out along the freeways in Los Angeles where we were projecting what he was writing in the hospital room. So it was a way for him to write graffiti in some of those locations that he was actively writing graffiti in the past. So again, it's about using technology sort of for personal empowerment, and it's a free project that would go on, and other people worked with it after this point. So that was the iWriter project. Those were both, like, in my perspective, larger collaborative projects that I was a part of. During that same period, I was also doing individual smaller projects. I've always been very inspired by the net art scene. I make net art. A lot of my early work was directly influenced from the net art scene. And so this is work that's natively meant to be viewed within the browser, that requires the network for viewing. This is just one example from 2014, a series called No Original Research, where I was taking animated GIFs that I would find on Wikipedia, and I would copy them dozens of times, pull them all into the browser, and when the browser would kind of fail to all load them perfectly, you'd get left with this sort of trace of that data's path through the network, so that every time you would hit refresh, the piece is going to look different on this network than it would look in my hotel's network. And so rather than rendering this perfect circle, what gets rendered is the latencies that are built into the network. So just one example of net art, which is a continuing interest of mine. Moving a little bit further, other projects of mine were also dealing with our relationship to technology, our changing relationship to technology. This was from a series called Multi-Touch Paintings, where I would take a piece of tracing paper and put it over my phone, and then I would dip my finger in ink, and I would just perform the tasks that my phone would ask me to perform. So this was a little bit earlier. So this is when the whole idea of multi-touch was both a new technology, but also clumsy in a certain way. And it was meant to sort of archive these first times that's in human civilization that we were required to do this multiple times a day. So this was slide to unlock, which is the phone. This one was a diptych called zoom in, zoom out. So these are all probably pretty familiar gestures to us at this point. Can anybody guess this one? This one's next, 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 next. So again, thinking about ways of archiving human gesture. Going forward one more year, this is a similar project that's also dealing with archiving gesture, but rather than leaving at looking at the traces that were left behind, this is looking at just the gesture, so just the dance. So it's called Dances for Mobile Phones. Maybe a connection to the labyrinth and the chromacrete here, where we're left just looking at the hand. So I would invite artists into the studio, film them. My invitation was just waste time on your phone. And I'm filming with an infrared camera, and since the phone doesn't emit any infrared light, you're left with just what the person's movement looks like, irregardless of what's happening on the screen. And then the only light that it does emit actually in the middle is the infrared light on the iPhone where it's doing facial tracking. But it was meant to be putting the person forward in this relationship with technology and be foregrounding these new gestures that we're doing daily, hourly. And so those two projects were starting to get into this idea of thinking about both archiving, like I'm interested in how a lot of my work will live on a longer time period, like how will this look in 20, 50, 100 years? And also, so the idea of archiving is very present in these series, and then the idea of visualization, or how do we see these sort of invisible structures that are a part of communication systems. And that led me, and I'm getting closer to my piece now, to this location that exists on all of our laptops, which is the cache directory from our browser software. And so when we're interacting with the internet on a browser, all of that data is stored locally. And I got very fascinated with this directory because it's unique in that it's both invisible on most operating systems. We're not invited into this directory. It's one you have to discover where it lives. And it's also a directory that's different in that it overwrites by default. So it's constantly being overwritten. As we're looking at more content online, that directory fills up and empties, and it fills up and it empties. And so it's constantly being overwritten, which is very different than the way most of our computers interact with data. So I started inverting that relationship with data, with that directory, and I started archiving it. So I would have a script that would just start, rather than letting that data disappear, it would save it. It would zip it up once every 2 weeks, and I have this huge collection of all these zip files of every image that I see on my browser on daily practices. And I was using that as raw material for making projects. The first one was for a series that I was calling Self-Portraits. You can see the connection here to the installation since you were born. But these were just taking one of those snapshots and filling the space in the most condensed ways possible with images and just letting them spill off the wall and onto the floor. And it was playing with some related themes to the installation here, obviously, thinking about surveillance, thinking about our relationship to images, and also the idea of couching this as a self-portrait was meant to be perhaps suggesting that this is a false portrait, that we are not sort of the representation or accumulation of our browsing habits, despite what Amazon would hope. I did other series with this data. This was a series called Silhouettes, that rather than looking at the content of those images, it was looking at the more aesthetic foundation structures of the imagery on the web, looking at hierarchy and shape. So this is just the outline of those images. It's using a similar technique if you've ever seen the 19th century portraiture technique where you would cut out of black paper the profile of the face. It's sort of playing with that idea and cutting this out of black paper. So this was called Silhouettes. I made another series with cache data that shares the title with the installation here. So this is the first time I used this title, Since You Were Born, was for this book. And this was related to her. So this is my first daughter, Octavia, sporting the fancy Pirate Bay onesie, the best baby gift you can give anybody. And so rather than dealing with this flood of images, which I was looking at for other projects at the time, this was dealing with the browser history. So you were all familiar with as you're browsing the internet, unless you clear them regularly, you have this list of every website you've been to. So I also increased those settings in my browser software. So I had this list of every website that I've gone to. And so the original version of Since You Were Born was this book, with just a chronological listing of every website that I visited from the moment Octavia was born. The preface of the book is my wife and I kind of like, you can see all the misspellings here, like hurriedly typing, pregnant, when to go to hospital, am I in labor? So this was the last Google searches. These were the last pages I saw before she was born. And then the book picks up from there, and it's an invitation to sort of look into one person's experience of a birth through their internet browsing habits. And it's an equal mix of very embarrassing and perhaps slightly telling and perhaps slightly not telling. I won't go into so much of it here, but there's everything from, I don't know, what's a funny one to poke at here? Like, there's breastfeeding searches in here. There's breastfeeding football hold, like we're doing Google searches on how to hold a baby. You can see all that happening in here, but you could also see things I'm embarrassed about, like checking email from the hospital room, like all that exists in here. So that was the book version. And then my second daughter was born. This is Aya. And so when she was born, I wanted to make a second version of the piece, which is the piece that we have in the exhibition here. And so the piece here is really a combination of the book Since You Were Born from my previous daughter and this self-portrait series. And rather than this becoming an object, the idea was to turn this into a space that people could step into. And rather than tying the data set and focusing it on me, it was meant to be reframed through her birth. And so this was the first time I installed it. This was 2019. And maybe my thinking on the work has maybe changed a bit over time. One thing I've thought from the beginning is that it's so much of me, but it really doesn't need to be me. This could be anybody. And my hope is that for the visitor, they're thinking less about me than they are at the confrontation that this image exists for all of us. This image, this trail of data exists whether you're using social media, you're shopping online. Corporations have portraits of us that are hundreds of times larger than this. Nobody else would give me this much access to their cache directories, so it had to be me by default. And in the first version of the installation, I had this kind of Easter egg where underneath the stairwell, I put this one small photo of her so that, and the idea of using her for the title is really meant to be a way for me to look at that data set and have something that's a barometer for something meaningful for me. Like when I look at this data set, when I step into that room and I start looking at it, which I'm so embarrassed every time I'm in that room, it's highly questionable to me how much of that data has any meaning. And especially when I frame all of that next to her and she becomes the ruler that I measure the meaning by and the interaction I have with this flood of images, this relationship is kind of why she became the title for that work. Maybe I'll just skip forward a bit here. There was moments in the first times I installed this when the piece kind of became an Instagram backdrop, and I went through moments of disappointment with that, but I've since really come around to the opposite side of that now. So I like that people go into the space and insert themselves into it. I like that they take photos of it, and so I encourage you to do so if you're in the space and feel so. Do not be embarrassed to take a selfie in there. And there becomes this kind of meta moment with the work then that when those photographs go online and they enter the browser cache of other people, then my entire data set is now in these invisible directories on the computers of other people, and there's this sort of circular process of the work where then those images may end up in the next version of this. And so there's this meta moment with the recycling of the cache data that I view as part of the life cycle of this project now. Okay. The work I've been doing since then, which I'm just going to show a brief overview of, it's really a kind of triplet of projects that work together around themes of land, earth, and sky. So it's a kind of net art piece called Landscapes, a painting series called Strands, and then a newer video piece called Skyscapes. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to these works to show what I've been doing since you were born. The Landscapes piece, Landscape series, it's connected back to that very first slide I showed with this very different internet, and how as the internet changed so much, I was really questioning how central I wanted its role to be in my life and in my work. And this is also a connection to Trevor Paglen's work, and again with the Labyrinth piece. And the idea for this initial trip was for me to go reset my relationship with the web, to understand it as something that wasn't just a cloud, to understand it as something that happened within nations and was privately owned. And it led me to these beaches, which other artists and researchers have done similar trips, but I encourage anyone who thinks about these things to take one of these trips, because these landscapes are so beautiful if you're into thinking about connected systems, because by default they're very lonely in a certain way. Like this is in Cornwall, which is, if you want to stand on top of the most data anywhere in the world flowing underneath your feet, this is where you go. But the beaches are very lonely because the internet is kind of fearful of anchors and fishing nets, and so they want to pick these lonely places for the internet to come abroad. And so that relationship to connectedness and loneliness, which is very much at issue with the exhibition here, is prevalent in these landscapes. And for me, if you're into cables and the internet, they're beautiful landscapes. In thinking about ways to document those landscapes, I was thinking about media, what media would be appropriate. And I'd already used infrared project in this other series, which you saw, the Dances for Mobile Phones. And infrared, if we were to go out in the street and dig up a fiber optic cable and cut into it, what we would not see with the naked eye shooting out of that cable would be an infrared laser light blinking infinitely fast. So the frequency that the internet modulates at it's actually around 1550 nanometers. It falls within this near infrared region. So this is the kind of frequency range that flows through fiber optic cables. And I modified a camera to film within that frequency range, and when you do that, you get images like this through the viewfinder. This is kind of what you're seeing, and it's not magic or anything. It's not like X-ray vision. It's not that you're going to see the data flowing through the air and under the ground, but it became a kind of conceptual lens for me to be looking at these landscapes through this frequency range. So in my work, this wasn't necessarily even about finding the cables. The majority of the imagery related to this series, once I got to those locations, I really allowed the lens to sort of wander, but it was really about existing within these landscapes, slowing down, making work. I'm thinking about these relationships. functionally how these were working, and maybe I'll just pull one up while it loads here. Let's see. There are these very slow videos. Sometimes you can't even tell they're moving. Let's see, this one's not moving yet. I'm gonna turn it down. And so when I would shoot the videos, this was in Cape Town. Those videos then I would put on servers within the same areas that I shot them. So this video would then exist on a server in Cape Town. And then as you would view the piece, the viewer would activate, physically they would activate a pathway from their laptop to that beach in Cape Town that was flowing through fiber optics. So you're kind of converting into infrared, flowing through the system, and you're really connected to those landscapes. And it becomes a second way of navigating the work. I don't know if I can do this with one hand. Let's try. So another part of this series is the URL to the work functions as a kind of dual address. So if you paste that into Google Maps, it functions as a URL within the network, and it also functions as a GPS coordinate on the globe. And so the title becomes this kind of singular gesture at talking about a landscape that's composed of two parts. And so another way of navigating these works is you can, as a net art piece, you can sort of use the net to have this secondary interaction with the work and kind of retrace some of the steps that happened with this project. So this is the one in Cape Town, and as our path through the internet speeds up slowly, maybe it will dramatically come into focus. Or maybe not, there we go. So another way of navigating the work is through the web. And then these pieces, the other connection with this color spectrum that I'm using has to do with this map. So this is our original globe spanning network. This is called the All Red Line. And this was a project at the height of the British colonial projects, the British Empire. This was a military advantage. So our first cable to go around the world only landed in British colonial occupied territories. And they called it the All Red Line because they would color their territories red on the map. And so the line that would connect all these territories was red. And so this is the other reference point I'm trying to make with this work has to do with the fact that this network that we are all a part of has a history. It has a colonial history. Most of the devices and systems that we're interacting with also have histories. And so the work that I'm trying to do with this series is bring that conversation a bit forward. And so when I'm installing the work, I'm also looking for ways to make connections to history, whether it's in the architecture, sort of salon-style arrangement here, or in some cases when I can work with museums to loan paintings of the same areas. And the idea being that this is meant to be not something separate from landscape-based image making, but something that's hopefully continuing this dialogue of landscape-based image making. So that's the landscape series. Yeah, I think I can do this, 10 minutes. The Strand series, it picks up on that idea of thinking about how ideology gets embedded within systems, but rather than looking at the landscape, it's looking at the earth, specifically at cartography, at mapping projections. And if you're not familiar with mapping projections, it's very simply the way you take a sphere and you flatten it. And all maps have some mapping projection, some mathematics that they're going through this process. All of them fail. One reason I love this field is because it's a known issue within mapping is that they say there's no perfect way to flatten an orange. Like there's no way you can take an orange and flatten it and not be distorting something. And so these distortions become interesting to me. Cartography in general becomes interesting to me because the idea of bias becomes so clear. Who gets the center? Who in terms of scale is emphasized or de-emphasized? Who gets the top of the map? And so to me, cartography becomes a way when we're thinking, again, about other systems, that idea, for example, of north being up, something that I took for granted and never questioned my entire life until relatively recently, come to find out, this has much more to do with history and emperors and power structures than it has to do with our position within the cosmos. And so if we can take that idea and think about, okay, what is the north-up bias of this system, or the system, the networks that we're a part of online, this is something I'm trying to think about now. And so to do this project, I made a piece of software, which I have here. It runs in a browser. It's free. Anybody can use it. It's called Worlds and Figures. I won't go into it in very much depth, but it basically has a drop-down menu of all those maps I showed earlier. So you can click through and see how different mapping projections might affect the system. And this was part of my painting process, was basically manipulating sliders. In the beginning, this was just a tool for me. It's public now, but for 3 years, it was only me using it. And so this becomes the beginning of my painting process, is using this software and thinking about distortion and thinking about bias to make paintings. Essentially, I'm exporting down here vector files that become painting masks, and I'm using a kind of old school hard edge painting technique. This is a show that just closed in Italy a couple weeks ago, just to give some examples of what these paintings look like. The human figure is incorporated. There's faces in there. This is a distortion technique. By inserting the human face, it's a cartographic technique, because our brains are more attuned to seeing how the human face is deformed than it is the continent outlines. So if you look closely in some of these, you'll see the outline of my wife's face. And then the last piece, and this is what I'm working on all of these currently, but this one I'm working on most recently, has to do with a more recent addition to the software, which is this animation cycle. And another way the software works is you can, for example, there's things that we can see the fiber optic cables and see how those are deformed, but we can also turn off all these layers. And then when you drag and drop an image in there, like this one, it'll update that background with any image, so that you can be manipulating any imagery with these old historic cartographic mathematics. And so that then when you start playing with what gets centered, who gets the top, when you start playing with relationship of center and map, you can then create these sort of animation cycles. And so this Skyscape series is using this functionality. It's thinking a bit about this relationship between circles and squares. If you've heard the term squaring the circle, it's a term used to mean trying to solve an impossible project. And so I like this kind of archetypal relationship between circles and squares that happens in a lot of art history and a lot of architecture, and thinking about how spheres translate to planes, and sort of the impossibility of making systems devoid of biases. And then this is the other inspiration for this series. This is the sky over where I live right now in Berlin. It looks like this for like 4 to 5 months out of the year. Every day, it's very, very gray. And my seasonal depression led me to seek the sky. And so the initial pieces in this series, anytime the sky would open up in Berlin, I would go out, I would shoot photos of the sky, and then I would make these animations from them. And these are just some examples of those pieces. They're very slow. I'm really interested in slow practices, so especially in these last 3 series, like the landscapes work is very slow. I'm interested in painting partly because it's an inherently slow art practice. And the skyscapes pieces are also meant to be slow. I find slowness as an interesting way of wrestling with accelerationist tendencies that we're all forced to. And so the work is, you can view it, I'm showing it in exhibition spaces, but I'm also interested in all 3 of these series. I'm interested in them existing within the home also, and that the home being perhaps the slowest intake of art you can have. And it's like an experience that most of us don't get to have because art is usually expensive. But this is where I wash dishes and make coffee. And this is a monitor I had left over from an old exhibition. And so when the sun doesn't come out in Berlin, I put these pieces on this, and it becomes this sort of window to another sky. And so all those pieces I recently put online now. So if you go to any of these weird looking links and you click one, you can then load them onto, like if you have an old phone you're not using, if you have an old laptop you're not using, these can run there for if you similarly suffer from seasonal depression and need a bigger interaction with the sky. Or if you're interested in living with art, if it's an experience that you haven't had, because it's something that's even part of my practice now. Like I try not to even show work that I haven't lived with for 3 months, because after 3 months you really know if it's worth showing anymore. So with that, I'll circle back to the end, and hopefully there's some connections there, or if not, you can be thinking about the connections between these series. And I really just want to say thank you again. I feel like I'm leaving tomorrow, and I feel like I just learned so much more to have more conversations with this incredible group of artists here. So thank you again, and with that, if we have time, we can do Q&A.
いや一番
I think this was the most fun, wide-ranging perhaps, starting from the iWriter series, network, slides, smartphones, the landscape series, the cartography, and if you have an iPad, iPhone that you're not using, then you can use it as a means of enjoying Evan's work by putting that onto the wall. So we've had a tracing of the more than 10 years of his work, and because there's so much that was discussed, I'm really in a quandary about how to start my questions. But out of all the really fun, intriguing work that you've shown us, how you actually made the work, how you are actually going to be developing these projects are issues that we are interested in, of course. But I was wondering more than anything about what you find the most interesting direction right now. What is interesting you right now at this point in time?
To the art that I want to make next?
Yes.
I'm having this this really good problem right now where I'm really interested in making music all of a sudden, and so it's a really good problem, but it's like I've already told this story to some people, but I have a small music studio in the basement of my apartment, and then my art studio is a 20-minute commute, and I keep going down in the basement instead of going to the art studio. And my wife, who works with me and is a huge supporter of my work, sometimes she's like, "When are you going back to the art studio?" So, it's a good question. I tend to, as a rule, try to follow passion. Like when passion exists and I'm excited, I try to follow that, which I think lots of artists do. At the moment, between the music and the skyscapes is kind of where my attention is at the moment.
And during the preview, we had your album playing on in the background, and I think that if you go to the website, you go to Evan's website, you're going to be able to hear the music as well without having to pay any additional charge. because he's rotary phone is the name that he's active under, and Are You Still Watching is the title of the album.
Which is what Netflix tells you when you fall asleep.
Okay.
When you fall asleep watching Netflix and you wake up and it's
Yeah.
just been running, it has this, "Are you still watching?"
Yeah. じゃあ次は会場の
Next, I'd like to ask if anybody from the audience has any questions.
Thank you very much, Evan. Wonderful talk. And I have a question about the book in connection to the exhibition. How was the book received differently than the exhibition? Because there's a lot of things that talks together in the way you did the book that you showed in the beginning and the piece that you are showing. So if you could talk a little bit about that, the difference for you.
In terms of reception of the work?
Yeah. How did people see the book? Because it's such a different media, and I work very much with books. So I'm curious to hear about that. And then I just have a comment on your pictures of the sky, because that was something you talked about, your own so-called depression of the weather in Berlin. And I can just tell you very shortly that working with inmates in the prison, when they found out that they could photograph the skies, it was something that made them absolutely excited and very, very positive feeling for them. So it was the exact opposite as what you have experienced. That was just a statement.
Yeah.
But to the first question.
To the first question, I almost don't know how to answer it because they're so different in scale. I mean, the difference between the reception of those is the book went almost unnoticed, and then the installation, because of the scale, because it invites people to be in it and to take part in it, I get to see people experiencing that work more than the book. They also came out at different times. I think the overlap of Since You Were Born with Instagram allows me to participate in it remotely. I can watch people interacting with it when people are posting on it, whereas the book, which in some way feels more personal, like if someone were to really look at every image versus read every word in that book, I'd probably be more embarrassed on the book side somehow. But one thing I did intentionally with the book when I released it was I released it as kind of a raster image rather than a text-based one. So if you wanted to read it, you had to read it. You couldn't search it, if that makes sense. I mean, you could go through processes to do that, but I intentionally made it kind of so you couldn't just sit there and do keyword searches and try to, look at this embarrassing thing. Like, you could find the embarrassing things, but it required time and slowness to actually read it to uncover them, if that makes sense. But I think because of some of those dynamics, it made that piece so much quieter, which is totally fine with me. But it's hard for me to even gauge user reaction to that one because I didn't get much. Or, if it was in the gallery, I didn't get to see people watching it. And if I had it online as a free download, and if people downloaded, I'd never really heard back there wasn't a comment section at the bottom.
Thank you.
今2人の対話の中で登場したその
And Since You Were Born, the book can be seen in the library. So if you're interested, you can go to the art library on this floor to go and look at the book itself. So it's now 4:30 and it's time, so we'd like to wrap up. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you for attending. Thank you for joining us. And thanks to the artists.